There is a very specific discussion that then relates to women visiting the graveyards. Women visiting the graveyards. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he cursed those women who would frequent the graveyards. Okay? And in one narration, those women of niyaha, women who would wail or mourn at the graveyard. So there's an interesting discussion that takes place here with our mother Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha. Some of the companions understood that the prohibition on women then visiting the grave still remained, that the prohibition was only lifted for the men. Aisha radiallahu anha, al-Mu'mineen, didn't understand it that way. In fact, she would go visit the grave of her brother Abdurrahman ibn Abi Bakr, and she would make dua for him, and then she would return home. And she was approached by some of the companions and censured, like, wait, what are you doing? Right? The Prophet ﷺ prohibited and cursed the women that would frequent the graves. And Abdurrahman ibn Aban, when he used to go to the graveyard, like his grandfather, and remember death, subhanAllah, I just want you to think about the sight. When he would come out of the cemetery, like the word would spread amongst the poor people, and amongst those who were enslaved, that Abdurrahman is visiting the graves right now. Why? Because as soon as he leaves the graveyard, he starts to free people from slavery. And he says, oh Allah, just as I freed this person from captivity, free me from the captivity of hellfire, free me from the punishment. And then he starts to give sadaqah to those that are poor. He starts to give charity to those that are poor. And this is the practice of many of the Salaf, by the way, many of the pious predecessors, that as soon as they would leave the graveyard, they'd immediately spend and they'd give to the poor. So the reminder of the hereafter is supposed to disconnect you from the deception of this world. It's supposed to disconnect you from the deception of this life. And there was a practical, manifest benefit that you would see based on what the Prophet ﷺ mentioned as the primary purpose for going to visit the graveyard, is that it reminds you of the hereafter. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ said, Inni kuntu nahaytukum, I used to forbid you. How long was the prohibition in place, and what did the prohibition entail? The prohibition was in place up until the last 2 or 3 years of the Prophet ﷺ's mission. Very interesting. Which means that up until the last 2 or 3 years of the Prophet ﷺ's life, you only went to the graveyard for the janazah. You only went to bury and then you left. Okay, there was no concept of ziyarat al-qubur outside of that, of visiting the graves outside of that. Why? Why do you think that is? Why would there be a prohibition of something so good? To avoid shirk. To be specific, these are people that are coming out of idol worship. They're coming out of idol worship. And the place where you could immediately dip right back into some of those things that you have left off is the graveyard. And so there is a solidification of tawheed, a solidifying of tawheed that has to happen, of monotheism that has to happen, and the rulings of Islam being firmed in the hearts of the people and in their practices, so that they don't start to mix up these concepts, because they're fresh in Islam. They're still fresh in Islam. So the ulama mentioned in the sharh of this hadith that when people are hadithan fil Islam, they're new in Islam, they still need time to sort these things out. And the graveyard is a place where your emotions get the best of you. It's a place where there are indeed so many things that are happening, right, around you. There's adhab here, there's na'im here, there's punishment here, there's reward here. There's so many things happening. And we can see that a person can get truly lost if they don't have a solid understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that fear was subsided by that point. That's number one. Therefore, the benefit of being reminded of the akhirah overtakes now the fear of the potential falling into practices that are contrary to Islam. What that means is that if you're in a situation where the practices could actually become contrary to the benefit, the reminder the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning, then a person should be careful, right? That this is for someone that really understands Islam, understands the nature of monotheism, understands that those that have passed do not benefit you. In fact, you are the one that can benefit them with your dua and things of that sort. And they don't get, tangled into some of these concepts. So that's the first thing. The prohibition was removed. The second thing here is that there is a very specific discussion that then relates to women visiting the graveyards. Women visiting the graveyards. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he cursed those women who would frequent the graveyards. Okay? And in one narration, those women of niyaha, women who would wail or mourn at the graveyard. So there's an interesting discussion that takes place here with our mother Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha. Some of the companions understood that the prohibition on women then visiting the grave still remained, that the prohibition was only lifted for the men. Aisha radiallahu anha, al-Mu'mineen, didn't understand it that way. In fact, she would go visit the grave of her brother Abdurrahman ibn Abi Bakr, and she would make dua for him, and then she would return home. And she was approached by some of the companions and censured, like, wait, what are you doing? Right? The Prophet ﷺ prohibited and cursed the women that would frequent the graves. And she mentioned that prohibition was for everyone until when the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that I used to forbid you from visiting the graves, And that included the men and the women. And when the Prophet ﷺ then opened the door of ziyarah, she said that that was for men and women. However, what would remain then? So you have effective clauses of prohibition. What would remain is the prohibition on a niyaha, which is wailing, not crying. Crying is fine. Niyaha is to wail loudly, to shout, to, hit yourself, to tear the hair, to tear the clothes, which in some cultures, by the way, that's actually an expression of mourning, okay? Like to tear something or to scream or to shout. And that hurts the dead, whether men or women do it. It hurts the dead, but it was more predominant amongst the women. And so the effective clause of the prohibition of niyaha would remain, right? And so during the actual burial, if a woman feels like she's not going to be able to hold herself and that the crying and the mourning and the wailing would overtake her, then it's better for her not to be in that situation at all. Even according to the opinion of our mother Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, to not fall into that. And then the second one, to be on the safe side as well, if it's frequency, to frequent the graves. Because that was also in the effective prohibition prior. Again, some of the schools of thought allow for, based upon what Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha is saying, and her understanding of this hadith, allow for women to visit the graves and to be reminded. And some of them maintain the earlier prohibition. The other thing that is taken from this narration is the Prophet ﷺ saying that he was given permission to visit the grave of his mother. And there's a famous narration, we talked about it when we actually covered the biographies of the mothers of the Prophet ﷺ, those who played the role of being mothers to the Prophet ﷺ, as well as his actual mother Amina. That the Prophet ﷺ went off on the side, one day during a journey, and he traveled the barren path, and the Sahaba followed him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he came across this grave, and he started to weep heavily, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was in deep pain. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would weep, his chest was like a boiling kettle pot, and the tears started to flow down from his eyes, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And subhanAllah, the companions cried with him just because they knew that what was happening to him was something significant. Then he mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that this is the grave of my mother. Ista'dhantu Rabbi, I asked my Lord permission to visit the grave of my mother, and my Lord allowed me to do so. Then he mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I asked my Lord permission to do istighfar for her, to seek forgiveness for her. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give him the permission for that, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to do istighfar. Now someone might say, and this is especially hard for people whose parents were not Muslim when they passed away. That's a deep pain and it's a deep grief. What happens here in this situation? And so, not to get into the whole discussion of like what's the status of a person who died anyway between the time of the Prophet ﷺ receiving revelation and Isa alayhi salam's departure, right? That they existed at a time when there wasn't clarity in revelation, and they fall in the general window of those who are excused, according to another authentic narration. Not to get into that whole discussion, but just to get into the discussion, it's an important one, of when someone who passes away that wasn't Muslim, or that didn't used to do istighfar for themselves, that didn't used to pray themselves, that didn't used to do siyam for themselves. There's an important distinction to be made here. Allah Azza wa Jal has prohibited us at the hukum level, at the ruling level, from doing something on behalf of someone that they themselves did not used to do, right? So if a person did not used to do istighfar for themselves, seeking forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala themselves, then you can't do istighfar for them. If a person was negligent in regards to their siyam, for example, their fasting, then you don't do fast for them, right? But there are narrations, for example, about someone that had some days that they missed, needing qada, where they were fasting. So they were people who used to practice fasting, and so you extend them by making up fasts on their behalf. This is authentically narrated from the Prophet ﷺ. So the idea here is that our relationship with the dead is to extend what they had already set into motion. I want you to understand it in the greater framework. If they used to make dua for themselves, you're making dua for them now. If they used to give sadaqah themselves, you're giving sadaqah for them now. They used to fast themselves, you're fasting on their behalf now. You're completing fasts that they may have missed. Right? They'd intended to make hajj, they weren't able to make hajj, you do hajj for them. Or they did hajj or did umrah, and you do that, you extend those good deeds that they themselves used to participate in. That's the nature of ibadah that's done on behalf of someone that has passed away, and it is under the chapter of ibadah. Now, the specific state of that person, how that person is being treated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what that person's ultimate decree is going to be, their ultimate judgment is going to be, that is to Allah alone. That is to Allah Azza wa Jal alone. Because Allah is al-adl, Allah Azza wa Jal is the just, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Rahman, Allah is the merciful. You're not going to be more just than Allah. You're not going to be more merciful than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If there's an excuse for that person that exists, Allah Azza wa Jal will determine that. if some excuse exists for them. But we deal with the outward and the legal and the continuation. So our prohibition from making istighfar on behalf of someone who didn't used to make istighfar, or doing dua on behalf of someone who wasn't making dua themselves, is because we deal with the outward realities here. But the inward, that is to Allah Azza wa Jal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making the ultimate decision in regards to a person. And so you should not delve too deeply into the individual fate of a person. Rather, the sacred connection of istighfar or sadaqah or dua is from someone who used to practice those things themselves. And so you're extending them by extending practices, and that is from the rahmah of the believers between one another. The rahmah of the believers between one another, that they are connected in that way. And so the dua then, when we enter into the graveyard, is also very telling that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, كان النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام يعلمهم إذا خرجوا إلى المقابر أن يقول قائلهم السلام عليكم أهل الديار من المؤمنين والمسلمين وإنا إن شاء الله بكم لاحقون أسأل الله لنا ولكم العافية. When you visit a graveyard and you speak to the occupants of the grave, or you make dua for the occupants of the graves, you're doing takhsis, you're specifying the believers amongst them. SubhanAllah, I actually want to tell you all something very interesting. Right now in our cemetery, we have obviously the Muslim section in Capel. I was driving out one day and I noticed that there was a Bosnian family, Muslim family, that had a crescent on their tombstone, but it's not in the Muslim section. And I was thinking to myself, I pray that every time we enter into the graveyard and we make that dua for the believers, that it's reaching them as well, right? And the only reason I caught it one day is I just took that route out of the cemetery and I noticed the Bosnian flag, and I noticed when I went there, Muslim names. I thought, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive them or forgive their relatives. They weren't buried amongst them, but clearly there is an indication of their Islam. And so this is a rahmah. Again, the legal connection is that the believers continue their mawadda in that sense, their connection with that sense through dua and through seeking forgiveness and things of that sort. And this is specific to the believers. And so make this dua when you enter into the graveyard. And you enter into the graveyard. And then, when you come to the Muslim section and you're making dua for al-mu'mineen wal-muslimin, you're making dua for the believing men and women, the Muslim men and the women, you're sending salam upon them. You're even reminding yourself in the nature of the dua, right? وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ بِكُمْ لَاحِقُونَ. You are those who preceded us. أَنْتُمُ السَّابِقُونَ. You have preceded us, and we are soon to follow. That's the first way that you are addressing. نَسْأَلُ اللَّهَ لَنَا وَلَكُمْ الْعَافِيَةَ. And there are different variations of this narration. They all surround the same themes. That we ask Allah for us and for you pardon and forgiveness and safety. You can connect this to the Laylatul Qadr dua. Allahumma innaka afuwan tuhibbul afwa fa'fu anna. You're asking Allah for them and for yourself, al-afiyah, to be spared and to be granted safety. And so you have that recommendation as well, meaning you can go and you can make dua for specific people in the graveyard, but realize that you're making dua for everyone that's in the cemetery that's a believer as well. Don't be bakhil, don't be stingy. When you walk into that cemetery, make dua for everyone in the cemetery, and then you go and you visit whoever it is that you want to visit. And if you want to make specific du'as for them, then you can, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ prohibited, an authentic hadith, for a person to sit on top of the grave. And it was a strong prohibition from him, alayhi salatu wassalam. قال لأن يجلس أحدكم على جمرة فَتُحْرِقَ ثِيَابَهُ. He said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that for you to sit on a burning stone that scorches your garment and that would reach your skin is better than for a person to sit on top of a grave. And so you show respect to the graves as you walk there. You try to observe their space as much as possible. You don't sit on top of a grave. Obviously, when we're doing burials, sometimes a person will have to step on different graves in order to carry out the burial. But even then, there is a mindfulness that we have. And this is also part of the beauty of Islam, that when a person dies, the way that we treat their body, the way that we bathe them, the way that we do ghusl, the way that we do their kafan, that you honor the dead as if they're still alive, because they are alive in a different dimension. And so this is also part of the prohibition that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned. Also, finally, you have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ from Anas radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that مر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بامرأة تبكي عند قبر, that the Prophet ﷺ walked past a woman that was crying next to a grave, and he said, اتق الله واصبري. Be mindful of Allah and be patient. Be mindful of Allah and be patient. Interestingly enough, subhanAllah, this hadith, if you're reading it from a fiqh perspective, you start to derive rulings. And so one of the proofs of those who said that women are not prohibited from visiting the graveyard is this hadith. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ did not tell her to go home. He didn't tell her that you've done something wrong, or that you're being punished, or but instead he told her to be patient. There's a lesson here though, that if you're reading this from a spiritual perspective, that's to console a person at the grave. What was the Messenger of Allah ﷺ doing? Was he admonishing her? Prophet ﷺ was offering her, a form of admonishment, but also consoling her. Wasbiri, be patient. That there's an etiquette when you speak to the believers and you speak to your brothers and sisters as you see them at the graveyard. And subhanAllah, you'll find people sometimes that are standing there, that are remembering their loved ones. It means the world sometimes. You go there, you say salam, you make dua for their loved one as well. Just say salam alaikum and stand and make dua for their loved one as well, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Right? But just to show that connection that you still have with them.